Right then, Docker for Windows. What's it all about? Well, first up, Docker for Windows is actually the name of a product from Docker Inc. So that's the product we're looking at here. And it's all about getting a small Docker environment up and running locally on your Windows laptop or desktop. Right now, that's got to be Windows 10 64-bit. But who knows what other versions might or might not be supported in the future. Right now though, at the time of recording, we're Windows 10 64-bit only, which is a great platform, I think. Let's not get religious though. Oh, good point. Now, I am assuming a bit of a clean system here, meaning it's gonna work smoothest and best if you've not previously installed the Docker Toolbox or Docker Machine or anything like that. I mean, if you have, I'm sure it's probably still gonna work. I'm just aiming for the cleanest installation scenario possible because as much as I'd love to, I can't be technical support for every nuanced install. Anyway, what you're going to end up with at the end of this clip is a fully working, single engine Docker environment on your Windows desktop or Lappy. But it's really only for test and dev work. You're definitely not going to want to run your production estate on it. I mean, it's only a single engine, remember, so it's not scalable or anything. And you might even find that not all features work straight away. The guys at Docker are very much taking a stability first, features second approach here. So yeah, definitely it's good for test and dev, and of course it's brilliant for learning Docker. Now, the other thing I want to point out before we go any further is that at the time of recording, although this is Docker for Windows, what you're going to get here is the Docker engine, which is just a fancy way of saying Docker, or the Docker server, but it's going to be running on Linux. Now, stay with me here. Linux inside of a Hyper-V virtual machine. Now, yeah, I've drawn it on the screen for a reason. Take a second or two to let that sink in. This is Docker for Windows, but we're getting a Hyper-V virtual machine running a Linux VM called Moby Linux VM, and inside of that, we're going to run Docker. And I know I can hear some of you asking, so what do you call it Docker for Windows for then if it's on Linux? Well, we'll see in a second, but for now, right, despite all of the Linux and virtualization magic going on behind the scenes, what you're going to end up with is the ability to fire up a command prompt or PowerShell if that's your thing, and just whack in Docker commands and it's going to work. It'll be just like you've got a fully working Docker engine locally. The only thing to note is that it's running on Linux behind the scenes, and that obviously means you can only run Linux containers on it. Though, one final thing before we actually get to install it. It seems very much like native Docker for Windows 10 is coming, so stripping out at the very least this Linux stuff here, giving you access to a Windows kernel, so proper Docker on Windows, yeah? Now at the time of recording, that's only available if you signed up for the Windows 10 Insider builds, but soon enough, right, I reckon it'll probably make its way to mainstream Windows 10. Anyway, far too much waffling. How do we install it? Well, first up, you've got to make sure that you've got the Hyper-V feature installed. So from Control Panel, Programs and Features, just hit Turn Windows Features on and off. Then Hyper-V here, put a checkbox in it. And off you go. Okay, Windows wants a restart. You might need to do that. Me, on the other hand, I'm going to use the Force. Thanks, but I don't need a restart. Okay, good. Now then, for those of you who do need a restart, well, at least one of you has told me about an issue that you've hit where you followed along, but you got this message. Basically, hardware virtualization support was not enabled in the machine's BIOS. So, if you do have this issue when starting Docker on your Windows 10 PC, then you need to bounce your box, hit the magic BIOS key like F12 or Del or I or whatever it is, right? Go into your BIOS and enable hardware virtualization assists, you know, like Intel VT or AMD V. Plus, if you can, while you're in there, you might want to check that things like second level address translation, SLAT, and data execution protection are also enabled. The point is, if you get this message or a similar one after you've enabled Hyper-V in Windows, restart your machine and check that hardware virtualization assists are enabled in your BIOS. And it goes without saying, I hope, be mega careful when poking around in the BIOS. I mean, mega careful. Anyway, after you've installed the Hyper-V feature and you've restarted, head over to the Docker website. You're going to want Get Docker here. Okay, now we're all about Windows at the moment, so we'll download Docker for Windows. Again, I'm not waiting for that download. Jedi mind trick again. The file is downloaded. Lovely. Okay, so let's fire it up. Of course, I agree to the license agreement, and off that goes. Okay, this is going to launch Docker for us. I've tried to be clever here and record it on my second monitor so you don't see all my clutter on the desktop. So you don't get to see the tiny little icon thingy. Although actually, I will record it later, then I'll patch it in. And here we go. This is what you'll see. Check that out, like a little window inside of a window. But the thing is, right, on the status bar, you'll see this Moby Dock whale here. And if you click Settings, you get into a bare bones UI. There's been a bunch of talk about a more feature-rich UI, maybe Kitematic if you know that. But for what we're doing here, we don't need to get sidetracked into that detail. What we really want is a command line. Okay, so the first thing I always do is a Docker version for a sanity check. Great, we're working. Now, if you look closely, right, see how the client is Windows, and then down here the server's on Linux? That server bit, remember, is running inside that Hyper-VM, easy for me to say, it's running inside that Hyper-V VM. Magic. So, all regular Docker commands should now work. Lovely. Now, the only other thing to note, I guess if you're curious, you can spin up Hyper-V Manager and dig a bit deeper. You know what? I recommend you do that. It's a great way to get your head around what's going on behind the scenes. But yeah, that's the Docker for Windows installation. Next up, Docker for Mac.